Over the past 5 weeks, I have completed a sorcery-only playthrough of every Souls game, including Elden Ring. I have struggled, suffered, and cast every slight variation of soul arrow that exists. Today, I'm going to talk about that experience, comparing and contrasting these runs across what are, in fact, very different games. If you haven't seen those runs, I have a playlist where you can watch them all that I will link in the description, or put up a card. I'll figure out how to do one or both of those things. There may be a description, there may be a card. But grab a coffee, a tea, or other beverage of your choice, and get comfortable. I've got a lot to say. Okay, so I'm going to break down my thoughts on this experience in a couple categories. And to make sure I stay on track, or as on track as I am capable of being, let's go to our old friend Tier Maker. Everybody loves a tier list. This will not be a tier list. It will, however, let us dynamically put the Souls games in order based on what we're talking about, though, which is handy. First item on the list is difficulty. Probably the first question that comes to mind when people think of a challenge run: how difficult is it actually? And because difficulty is a universal concept, unburdened by subjective perspective and experience, I can speak authoritatively on this topic across all of these games. Let's start at the beginning, 2020. No, wait, actually 2009, with the original game Demon's Souls. Except we are kind of starting in 2020, because that's when the remake produced by Bluepoint came out. Now, my understanding is that this is a pretty faithful recreation of the original game, so everything I say should apply to both versions, but if you do want to do this challenge run in the original game on the PS3, be warned. Except Brightwater. This item gives you FP regen for a short period of time, and I used it pretty extensively in my playthrough, and that was not available in the original release. At least according to Fextralife, and I have no way of verifying this claim. It's not really that big of a difference, since regular and slightly better than regular spice is very easily purchasable, which I learned to my considerable embarrassment. So when compared to the other games, how does Demon's Souls rank? Dead last. Demon's Souls is the easiest version of this challenge by a pretty decent margin. Demon's Souls is already the easiest of the 5 games. Despite some enemies shenanigans and some frankly dodgy game design, the game is a very easy introduction to the Souls series, especially considering the escalating difficulty of the later entries. Tacking magic on top of that makes it even easier. Magic is so comically unbalanced, I feel like it must be intentional. Again, this is the final boss of the game, and a single spell makes his damage so pitiful as to be barely worth noticing. And that's assuming the enemy even gets an attack in. Demon's Souls doesn't have a very large selection of magic spells, but what it does have is more than enough. You can deal both fire and magic damage, a combination nothing in the game resists, at least not to any real degree. You can rapid fire, you can attack close, you can attack far, you can buff your defenses in 3 different flavors. Nothing in this game can stand up to sorcery. Even the heftiest wall in the series falls flat because his shield doesn't have 100% fire resistance. Moving on, we get to Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 is going to sit right in the middle of this list. Casting in this game is mostly the same as in Demon's Souls, except we lose the ability to deal fire damage, which goes to the new Pyromancy school of spell. This change hurts a lot. In Demon's Souls, there was no area that could withstand the combined access to both damage types. Now, any enemy with high magic resistance would be a considerable wall. Particularly of note was Seath's Archives, where it was faster to die repeatedly while running around than try to actually kill anything. This change to remove access to non-magical damage for sorceries would reverberate across future games. We'll talk in more specifics in a later section, but casting spells is pretty rough in this game, and while sorceries can deal a lot of damage, actually using them effectively can be challenging. However, I can't really put Dark Souls 1 any higher than 3rd place. Only a few of the required bosses in Dark Souls 1 actually felt challenging in any real way. To be frank, the difficulty of this run feels difficult due to bad design, rather than intended challenge. What can I say? Games have changed a lot since 2011. I waffled a lot on where to place Dark Souls 2 in this ranking. It's very weird because Dark Souls 2 has, to my mind at least, the most hostile world of any of the Souls games. Getting from boss to boss in this game is a gauntlet, and the game not making you invulnerable while interacting with levers and doors means you need to actually face that gauntlet. Ultimately though, I had to put Dark Souls 2 in 4th place on this ranking. While the world is the harshest in any game, the actual boss fights are not. I can't really think of a single boss in this game that pushed me in any real way. Even Smelter Demon, may he rest in hell, isn't actually that hard, he's just situated at the end of an incredibly obnoxious run-up. Dark Souls 2 gives you a lot to work with, and expands on Dark Souls 1's spell list in some very useful ways, and ultimately the true challenge of its gameplay, the bosses, comes up short. This may have been different if I did the DLC, but honestly, thinking back to playing through the DLC, I'm not sure it would be. Where I spent a lot of time undecided on Dark Souls 2, I knew exactly where Dark Souls 3 would land. I knew it before I even started, and my opinion remains unchanged. Dark Souls 2 earns the top spot very easily. This game fought me every step of the way. Dark Souls 3 is easily the hardest game of the Souls games. Even after multiple playthroughs, the bosses in this game do not mess around. Despite the introduction of some new and very useful sorceries, this game brings the challenge. Soul Greatsword, Fair and Flash Sword, and Pestilent Mist are amazing spells, but rather than be cheat codes that win the game for you, they are essential tools to overcome this game's hardest challenges. Remove even one of these sorceries, and I don't know that I'd have gotten through this challenge. Some of the game's difficulty may be related to me being underleveled, particularly for the twins, or being sick for the first half of recording, but not all of it. Not even most of it. This game earns the top spot by being harder than it probably should be, and a big no thank you to the DLC. And finally, that brings us to Elden Ring. No surprise where it goes, there is only one open slot left on the list. Elden Ring earns the number 2 slot, and it shouldn't be too hard to see why. Elden Ring does not mess around with its enemy design or enemy movesets. Malekith will kill you very quickly and very messily. The Godskin Noble's spins will stunlock you to death. Radagon would like to be right next to you and has a hammer for shattering Elden Rings and tarnished faces. However, unlike Dark Souls 3, which cranked the difficulty and left you basically where you were, Elden Ring has 100 goodie bags worth of nonsense. Carrion Slicer damage is so high, I think someone's hand slipped and everyone's too embarrassed to fix it. Night Comet pierces enemies, doesn't trigger dodge AI, and gets a 30% damage buff from its respective staff. A 30% buff it did not need. I could go on about Mist trivializing the only required boss with decent magic resistance, Rocksling letting you break the poise of a demigod, or all the talismans that let you crank your damage into the sky, but I don't think I need to. Elden Ring wants you to kill a god, and it gives you every tool you might need to make that happen. Okay, we've gotten the obvious answer out of the way and talked at great length about the comparative difficulty of a sorcery-only challenge run. Now on to something that may spring to mind less. How usable are sorceries in this game? And I don't mean how easy they are to access, equip, etc. I more mean how does the moment-by-moment play of these games feel when using only sorceries? We start, once more, at the beginning. Demon's Souls breaks out of last place and moves into 4th. It's still really low. Demon's Souls being the first game in the series probably suffers from time more than anything. Changes in game design and just general experience by the developers. Casting spells in Demon's Souls feels pretty bad, even though it's the 2020 remake. You do get a little casting animation that isn't too bad, but spells do not track at all. There doesn't seem to be any correction from when you hit the cast button to when the spell actually fires, so you better hope the enemy is either standing still, moving towards you, or is the size of a house. And to be fair, that is often the case, but it's not the case enough of the time. Ignite is such a breath of fresh air because it is a quick melee spell that doesn't solve these problems so much as bypasses them entirely. and then creates its own problems by having an area of effect that is, I think, actively deceiving you. Magic is very strong in Demon Souls, and honestly it needs to be, because if it wasn't, no one would use it because it feels like trash. Other than the buff spells, those are fine. Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 1. This is probably the game that feels the most aged. Demon Souls got a shiny new remake 3 years ago. Wait, that was 3 years ago? Oh lord, what is time? Anyway, Dark Souls 1 got a remaster that didn't really do anything other than make the game run at a semi-consistent frame rate. The mechanics of the game are wholly unchanged, which to be fair may also be true of Demon Souls. And that age shows, and feels, and earns Dark Souls 1 the coveted last place. Yeah, casting spells in Dark Souls 1 feels bad. They're strong, of course, but now they do not feel like anything. You cast spells, at least most spells, by doing this move, which just makes me think you're using the staff as a clapper in a bell over your head. Maybe that's intentional, but it's slow and has no impact or power behind it. And then the spell actually happens, and you've conjured an incredibly slow-moving, poorly tracking missile, because basically every spell is just Soul Arrow. They are all Soul Arrow. The tracking is bad, but the aiming is worse. It's so hard to hit anything that isn't bigger than you, and even when the spell hits, it has no impact. Like, did that enemy die, or are they just faking it to be polite? Like my wife. There's really no wiggle room here. Spellcasting in Dark Souls 1 is strong, effective, and feels bad in every way. Demon Souls is rough, Dark Souls 1 is worse. Now we're on to Dark Souls 2, Middle Child, relegated to undeserved criticism. What have you got for me? Oh, that's actually pretty good. That's great, in fact. See? Dark Souls 2 is good. I told you. No, you get out of here, adaptability. Jokes aside, Dark Souls 2's casting is great. The spellcasting animation has a snappiness to it. Spells shoot out quickly and track enemies pretty well, so it doesn't feel like you're firing wildly and hoping. Dark Souls 2 takes the coveted second place in spellcasting feel. It just does so much right to make spellcasting, a normally pretty passive affair, feel energetic and impactful, which sells its impact in a game like Dark Souls. And while the hit effects aren't really any different than they were in Dark Souls 1, the speed of the projectile does so much to make the impact feel like it hurts. The hit reacts may not be huge, but the projectile is traveling faster than a grocery store scooter. Dark Souls 2 gets a number of things wrong compared to its predecessor, but the feel of spellcasting is not one of them. And that brings us to Dark Souls 3, and I'm torn on this one. To lay my biases on the table, I don't really like Dark Souls 3. I think they tuned the bosses just a bit too far into the unfair territory, and it hurts my enjoyment of the game. So take that into consideration when I place Dark Souls 3 into a solid third place. The casting isn't bad, it's certainly better than Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls, but like many of the animations in Dark Souls 3, borrows too heavily from Dark Souls 1. It doesn't have any of the blatant problems that Dark Souls 1 had, though. Spells do aim properly, they can track okay, and the addition of Soul Greatsword and Farron Flash Sword does so much to add to the variety of spellcasting that Elden Ring will expand on even further. Even Pestilent Mist's slow, laborious cast feels right for slowly conjuring the most murderous cloud you ever done see. But all the gains in snappiness and feel that Dark Souls 2 added are just gone. You're back to ringing a bell in the air and shooting a very boring laser. The animation has no directionality, no oomph to it, you know? It feels passive and then a laser. Dark Souls 2 added a lot to casting that I loved, and Dark Souls 3's adherence to feeling like Dark Souls again is just a loss for me. Okay, Elden Ring is first. Obviously it's first. There was never a debate that Elden Ring was going to be at the top of the how usable is spellcasting list. Spellcasting in Elden Ring feels amazing. It finds the perfect middle ground between Dark Souls 2's snappy throwing a spell at an enemy and Dark Souls 1's graceful movements. This is the basic spell. It has movement, it has directionality, and it combos! Spells can combo now! Not all spells, but many can, and the variety of spellcasting animation is chef's kiss. Casting Night Comet is different than casting Mist, is different than casting Rock Sling. There's so much to love about the spellcasting here. Spells are different in how they cast and feel. Half the skill in casting spells in this game is understanding the difference in how this wide variety of spells needs to be used and the different casting works. Look at that, Glintstone Dart is just the Dark Souls 2 animation, with some refinement, except it can combo now. There's a lot of reasons to love Elden Ring. It really serves as the most adept version of a lot of what Souls games have been doing for over a decade. And just examining that through spellcasting really highlights how much the games have changed and improved over the years. And with that, we have finally arrived at my final avenue for comparison. Unlike the previous two categories, which were objective assessments free from personal bias, this last section is a bit of an opinion. Would I recommend any of these challenge runs to you, the viewer? No, obviously. I don't know you, and how did you get in my home? Probably more accurate to say, how likely would I be to recommend this challenge run to a hypothetical stranger? A connoisseur of Souls games, if you will. And we start, for the last time, with Demon Souls. This question is really interesting to ponder over. It takes into consider both of the previous categories and adds new wrinkles on top of it. Not just, is it hard or does it feel good, but also, is it fun? Questions we should all be asking this Valentine's Day. And Demon Souls just doesn't make the cut. It goes straight into last place. Don't get me wrong, I really like Demon Souls, and the 2020 remake is incredible, but I think it may have stuck a bit too close to its original release. Demon Souls is a pretty easy game, at least compared to the escalation the series and the genre have seen over the last 15 years, and Magic just adds another layer of do not recommend to the idea. Demon Souls is too easy, Sorcery is too strong, and it feels pretty bad to use. I think there are probably some good challenge runs in this game, runs that thread the line between delightfully challenging and utter bullshit, but this ain't it. Demon Souls kicked to the curb, we arrive at Dark Souls 1. So many people consider this a masterpiece, and I had a lot of trouble deciding exactly where to place it. Would it be last or not last? Ultimately, I decided on not last. Casting in both this and Demon Souls feels pretty bad, basically at every situation. What ultimately won Demon Souls the coveted Not the Worst award for this challenge run is the difficulty. Where Demon Souls feels bad and is too easy, Dark Souls 1 feels bad but can actually be challenging in places. And it's like a good kind of challenge. Facing down Orny and Smoo, figuring out how to bring mad deeps against the Four Kings, figuring out when to cast against Gwyn's never-ending jump attacks, these are good. These are interesting. This doesn't earn a higher place in my ranking because of all the other problems with it, but the places where the Dark Souls 1 Sorcery run shines, it really shines. It's really interesting. Just a shame you'll die trying to cast a spell against an unmoving dog standing right in front of you. And that brings us to our last three games. I suspected from the very beginning that Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 would be at the bottom of this list, and I was right, but sorting the last three has been tough. Dark Souls 2 just stands at the third place. I've said it plenty of times, but I really like Dark Souls 2, despite its many flaws. It beat out the other two games for this position, but I just can't rank it higher in the challenge run department. The casting feels good in ways that won't be matched by the series until Elden Ring, and is suitably challenging in some ways. Just not, to my mind, the right ways. I mentioned it earlier, but the bosses of Dark Souls 2 are basically all disappointing. Dark Souls 2 has the most hostile areas the series has ever seen. I mean, ask a fan if they'd rather go through the Shrine of Amana or the Lake of Rot. I would rather wade ankle deep through super poison than think about the Shrine of Amana, and that says a lot. The problem with this is a Dark Souls challenge doesn't shine in the areas or the random enemies you run into. Souls is at its best, its most visceral and satisfying, facing down a boss who is more than capable of flattening you into a pancake. Souls games triumph by putting a demigod in your way and saying you need to win this fight, and then you do. It may take a while, you may struggle, but that is what a Souls game is about. And the bosses in Dark Souls 2 just can't keep up. Certainly not in a sorcery-only run. So the best I can do is third. Sorry, middle child, but in fairness, it's the best you deserve. And with that, we arrive at Dark Souls 3 and have to decide where it fits in my ranking. Which, once more, functionally determines where Elden Ring will end up. And I think I spent more time considering this than any of the others. Dark Souls 3 is a complicated experience for me, probably possessing the highest highs and lowest lows of any Souls game. And not just in this challenge run, but in all my playthroughs. So where does Dark Souls 3 fit? Second. It gets to be in second. But that isn't as much a dismissal as I thought it would be before doing this. This game isn't my highest recommended to others, but it was the most satisfying to do. Dark Souls 3 doesn't pull any punches, but neither did I. I think Dark Souls 3, and a challenge run of it, is honestly too hard to earn the highest ranking in this list. This game is hateful, and aggressive, and unforgiving. It wouldn't be my first recommendation, but I think it is the best. Elden Ring gets to earn the top slot on this ranking, but it does so because Dark Souls 3 pushed me in ways Elden Ring never has. Thank you, Dark Souls 3. I hate you. Yeah, Elden Ring is first. I assumed it would be, and yeah, shocker, I'm right. Elden Ring just has so much going for it. A sorcery-only run is such an easy recommend for me. The wildest diversity of sorcery in all the games, the most variety of talismans, a weirdly large number of possible attunement slots, and armor that actually does things. It's also a pretty quick run because so much of Elden Ring is optional. My recording time for Elden Ring was shorter than any other game except maybe Demon's Souls? The game gives you Carry and Slicer if you want to be in melee, Magma Shot and Rock Sling if you need to deal non-magical damage, and Night Comet for when you want things really, really dead. Really, the only downside is the amount of errands you need to run to get random items from around the map. The linear-ish nature of prior games meant this wasn't really a thing, but I had a good errand session before basically every major boss, which was intentional. Most of that didn't need to be that spread out. Maybe worth considering doing like a region lock where you can't leave a given area of the map until you've killed the main boss in that area or something. This would tune the map regions into something more approximately linear areas of prior games. But it's not really necessary. Elden Ring is fun, sorcery-only Elden Ring is fun, Night Comet and Carrion Slicer are so much stronger than they should be, and I love them. And that is it. I have completed a sorcery-only run of every Souls game. I have documented that experience from start to finish, and done a lengthy summary of those runs, and how these games compare to each other. When I first started working on this video, a part of me was worried this video would be too short, like the summary wouldn't have been worth the detail, if that makes sense. Then I wrote the script and went, yes, I do in fact have too much to say about Souls games. I could have elaborated further. But I won't. I think this stands pretty well on its own. If you made it this far, and whether or not you've seen the runs I'm talking about, thanks for listening. Drop a like if it's worth it, comment something of value if you want, subscribe, stretch, get some water, vote in every election, signal before turning, look both ways before crossing the road. Yep, still better than the Shrine of Amana.